Good morning and welcome to the American Chamber of Commerce Breakfast with Lord Patten. My name is Tara Joseph. I'm president of AmCham, and we are absolutely delighted to have a packed ballroom this morning to sip coffee and listen to Lord Patten instead of drinking cocktails, which is what often happens in this room. I was very unhostess-like this morning and asked Lord Patten to sign his book for me so I wouldn't have to stand in the queue before he really had a chance to have his breakfast and coffee. And what I thought about in terms of the absolute crowd and excitement when Lord Patten comes to Hong Kong is, what is the appeal for so many people to hear Lord Patten, the last colonial governor of Hong Kong, Chancellor of Oxford, for his life come to speak. And there are many reasons behind it. It could be his wry sense of humor when he delivers a very important message, or maybe we actually miss having debonair gentlemen politicians who will really give us food for thought these days without having to tweet it out. But I have had the privilege of hearing Lord Patten speak on several occasions, and I really do understand why people want to come and listen. He really is a thought leader and really leaves us all with some things that we think about and take away with us as we go about our daily business. So we've given Lord Patten a slightly tough theme for a breakfast. It's prescriptions for one country, two systems. That's the theme for this morning. We'll also have Q&A, and if you'd like to buy a book, it's right back here. There are booksellers in the back of the room, and we would be delighted to make sure that you have time to do a book signing at the end. So without further ado, Lord Patten.
Tara, Consul General, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, thank you very much indeed for that flattering obituary, from which I'm extremely grateful. This is a really big day in my life because I finally made it to the front page of Tarkam Bao. I mean, really. If there's anybody here from that esteemed chronicle of the truth, I'd be like to express my gratitude, and I hope you'll be there this evening as well. Covering tonight's events, but many thanks to you and your three readers. Can I first of all say, and I don't just say it because I'm speaking to the American Chamber of Commerce, that looking back to my time here as governor, I think I received more intelligent support from the American Chamber of Commerce and from the American community than from any other group. The American Chamber of Commerce was always extremely well informed and had a very considerable consciousness of the importance of the relationship between economic and political freedom and the importance of the rule of law. They weren't always uncritical, but they were always thoughtful when they were critical. So thank you very much indeed for that. And I'm sure that's a tradition which lives on. My kids, my children, and particularly my grandchildren, are always surprised at my complete illiteracy when it comes to anything technical, and particularly, of course, anything to do with the internet or iPads or iPhones or whatever. And they don't understand why I have so much trouble comprehending the instructions on how to make these adjuncts of modern living work. I think I've got a reasonable point in my hand, on my side, because I always regard it as a spectacular oxymoron when I look at the instructions for my computer to see click the start button to turn off the machine. That seems to me in the same category as Sam Goldwyn, my answer is a definite maybe. It's a real oxymoron. And I thought of that this morning because Milton Friedman used to argue that one country, two systems was an oxymoron. That great economist, market economist, used to say that it was impossible to have capitalism and socialism working in one country. He used to say that it was impossible to have the rule of law and rule by law working alongside one another inside the same bounds of sovereignty. And I think that an attempt to deal with that problem required a very sophisticated approach. And it certainly got one with the idea, the notion that Deng Xiaoping first put forward of one country, two systems, not as one rather underbrief British minister called it when he came to Hong Kong, one nation, two states, which I did point out to him wasn't quite the point, actually, and might create some problems when he went up to Beijing and the rest of his visit. One country, two systems was, of course, designed not just for Hong Kong. It was designed for Taiwan and others. And it perhaps recognized the real difficulties there were, to be frank, on both sides in dealing with the handover in 1997. And let me be excessively candid about those. On the Chinese side, Hong Kong represented, understandably, the memory of some of the humiliations of 19th century history, when the then colonial powers behaved so intolerably in China. It's not something you can readily understand from the vantage point of the 21st century, even in the middle of the 20th century. President Roosevelt thought that colonialism should go away. So it was difficult, I think, for China to handle because of that, and it was difficult because against that background, Chinese leaders had seen for years thousands and thousands of people leaving communist China to try to get in to this outpost of colonial oppression. We all know, you look at any tower block in the city, and you can reckon that maybe half the people living in it were from families or themselves, clambered over barbed wire, swam through water to get to Hong Kong, where they saw the possibility of a better future for themselves. And that was, I think, a difficult thing for a Chinese communist in the Mao era or afterwards to accept and understand. So I think it was a problem on the Chinese side, and there were problems on the British side as well. Problems that were partly, I think, aggravated by the extent to which Westerners have very often thought that the only way you can do business with China is by acting in a supine way about anything political. I was always interested in the spectacular increase in exports from Britain to China in the years when I was here as governor, as you know, committing sin after sin. But there was an even bigger issue, I think, which made things difficult for Britain, which prides itself on being a parliamentary democracy. One of the last visits that I made was to a hospital for the mentally ill in the New Territories. And it was an old building with wards based on prefabricated huts, each one of them surrounded by wire fencing. And I was walking down the passageway between some of these wards and saw somebody, a chap, dressed in a three-piece suit, Chinese gentleman, rattling the wire around his ward and saying, Governor, could I have a word with you, please? And to the horror of my private secretaries and two policemen, I went over to the fence to talk to him. And he said, can I ask you one question, Governor? And I said, sure. So he said, how is it, I think you'd regard Britain as being one of the oldest parliamentary democracies in the world, and I don't think that whatever else you called it, you'd call the Chinese government a democracy. He said, how is it that you're handing Hong Kong over to China without ever consulting the people of Hong Kong and saying what they think? And that encapsulated the moral dilemma which any moderately liberal or sensitive British politician felt. Of course, it was always the case that Hong Kong was going to return to Chinese sovereignty in 1997. It would have been intolerable to have acted otherwise. But just as there were problems on the Chinese side in doing that, so there were problems on the British side. And perhaps we never did enough to bed down some of the freedoms and the democracy, which are still now matters of contention. I think we should have done more at the time of the joint declaration. Not a new point as far as I'm concerned. I've written about it and talked about it ad nauseam. So this may be called, this book, First Confession, but it's not my first confession. It's one of all too many. So one country, two systems was an extraordinarily sophisticated concept for enabling Britain and China to do what history dictated that we had to do, and to do it in as fair a way for people in Hong Kong as we possibly could. I remember when a group from Hong Kong went up to Beijing in the, I don't remember, I read about it, in the early 1980s, and they were concerned, and Deng Xiaoping said to them, set your minds at rest. He set out the importance of Hong Kong continue to operate in the way that it had for years, continuing to have a degree of local autonomy. And he said, people in Hong Kong can run their own affairs. People in Hong Kong are perfectly capable of running their own affairs. And that was what underpinned the attempts in the Joint Declaration and the Basic Law for making the handover as smooth as possible, and for ensuring that Hong Kong could continue to be one of the freest cities in Asia or anywhere, could continue to be as successful as, thank heavens, it's continued to be. Now, I think it's no secret to any of you that that went more smoothly in the early years after 1997 than it has in the last few years. I think there were legitimate arguments about whether it was wise to choke off the development of democracy in Hong Kong. People in Hong Kong had been promised by Director Lu Ping, by the Foreign Ministry, and in the media, in the papers in Beijing, that they would be able to determine the way they elected officials, the way they elected the Legislative Council themselves. And it didn't quite turn out like that. So there were arguments about those things, and there were one or two other cases which concerned people. But by and large, I don't think things were going too badly. I think there have been more problems in the last few years. And I hope that isn't just because of the passage of time. Some people suggest it's because the welcome growth, spectacular growth of the Chinese economy has made some leaders in Beijing think they don't have to worry about whether they've signed treaties, don't think they have to worry about what the rest of the world thinks. And it's certainly true that relatively, Hong Kong perhaps doesn't matter quite as much to China as it did, if you just look at figures like GDP. When I left Hong Kong, this is not what you'd say, what you'd call post hoc, ergo propter hoc. And when I left Hong Kong in 1997, the Hong Kong GDP was about 17% of China's GDP. Today the figure's about 3%. It doesn't matter, it doesn't mean that Hong Kong isn't hugely important to China, but clearly if you're just looking at those figures rather crudely, the importance has shifted a bit. So maybe some people say that because of that, Chinese leaders haven't been as concerned to take care of what happens in Hong Kong. There are others who say that increasing the grip on Hong Kong is related to the general crackdown on dissidents on the mainland. I hope that's not true. but it's something which is occasionally said. There are other arguments which are put forward to try to explain what has happened in the last few years. So how should Hong Kong react? How should others react if we want the conditions for Hong Kong's success to continue as they have been? I think there are 3 or 4 things which I'll say very briefly and telegrammatically so as to give you as much time as possible to ask questions. The first is this. Hong Kong will continue to be a free society. Hong Kong will continue to have a freedom under the rule of law. Hong Kong will continue to have growing accountability. Hong Kong will continue to have a pretty clean public service, so long as people in Hong Kong want that. I think there is in Hong Kong's DNA an understanding about the relationship between politics and economics. You don't have to be a Marxist to think that economic developments have political consequences. I think people understand that there is a real relationship between the rule of law, which makes commercial life so successful, and the rule of law, which makes it possible to be a citizen and to exercise the freedoms associated with citizenship. Because one of the things which I think is very special about Hong Kong is that it's a Chinese city, but it's a Chinese city with a great sense of what it means to be here in Hong Kong. There's a real sense of Hong Kong citizenship when you ask people about their identity. That doesn't make them less Chinese. It doesn't make me less British, that I have Irish ancestry, that I'm a Catholic, that I'm a Londoner, that I'm a supporter of, God help me, of Arsenal Football Club. None of that makes me, none of that, thank you, Emma, Arsene Wenger in the audience there. None of that makes me any less patriotic. But my values as a human being, the things I believe in for myself and for my family and for my grandchildren, they're all part of my being. They're all part of what makes me support the sort of society that we're in. They're part of the reason why I'll go back from here and be arguing about Britain's relationship with Europe until I'm blue in the face. So, citizenship is about the things you believe in. And it doesn't mean that you're less patriotic because they may be different from the things that a mainland official perhaps believes in. The second thing which I think is important if one country, 2 systems is to survive, and it's extremely important, is that I think it would be a good idea for some Chinese officials not just to talk about the rule of law, but not just to talk about the Hong Kong system, but to actually try to understand it more. Hong Kong 2 systems doesn't mean Hong Kong 1.7 systems, or, if not rounded up, 1.4 systems and rounded down. It means what it says. And if it's to survive, it's very important that people should understand what the Hong Kong system is. It is about fairness and decency and dialogue and, to use a French expression, solidarity, to use a British expression, clubbability. It's about the things which knit a society together, a society in which people by and large believe the same things. And when they argue, that they're able to argue without having a quarrel. One thing which has depressed me a bit, I have to admit it, coming to Hong Kong this week. Timing wasn't exactly perfect. One thing that's disturbed me is the extent to which people are shouting rather than talking. And I just don't think that's very helpful. When I was last here, I made clear my views about democracy and independence. I said I thought it was a bad idea if the argument for democracy slid into an argument in favour of independence, which isn't going to happen. which is provocative to people on the mainland and which dilutes support for the democratic cause. And Joshua Wong and one or two of his colleagues said, well, would you come and talk to us about that? And he said he'd get a few students together. Well, I went up to Lockhew Hall at Hong Kong University, and the place was packed. And I talked to students there. I set out my case. They listened very politely. I don't think I convinced them all. But we had a good argument, a good discussion, a good civilized discussion. And I did ask myself at the beginning of this week, who from the government or who from Beijing has been prepared to go and talk to people who disagree with them in that sort of way? It's not to diminish your authority to do that. It's actually to increase your authority if you're prepared to talk to people even when they don't agree with you. The third thing which seems to me to be important is the rest of the world should demonstrate that it's interested in what's happening here in Hong Kong, because Hong Kong is a great international city. The British have particular responsibilities because of the Joint Declaration. The Joint Declaration is a treaty lodged at the United Nations which lasts for 50 years. Lawyers here, particularly if you work on international law, will know that old Latin tag, pacta sunt servanda. A treaty lasts as long as it says it lasts. And if you don't keep a treaty, if you resile from a treaty once, people aren't going to trust you on another treaty. So I think the rest of the world will be watching very closely what happens here in Hong Kong, what happens to one country, two, not 1.5 systems, because they will think it gives you a pretty good indication of what might happen with other international obligations that China has undertaken. I don't say that in a provocative, hostile way. China is obviously going to be one of the great countries which determines what this century is like. But it's more likely to be able to do that in concert with others if others believe that it keeps its word. And a very good test case is going to be here in Hong Kong. So I hope that the rest of the world will continue to show an interest, and the British government is treaty bound to show an interest and shouldn't just expect other people to do it. The last point I make is a more sort of speculative one. Clearly, if you had to think of two countries which are really going to play the most significant part in the future of this century as we move along, it's China and the United States. I was in my youth, before Greek became too much for me, I was a student of the classics, and one great history we had to read was Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War. And the main point that people, geostrategists, which is a pretty good way of making your living, it's easier than being a plumber. One point that they make is that it's very important what they call the Thucydides trap. The Thucydides trap was a reference to the fact that what he's writing about in the Peloponnesian War is the efforts made by Sparta to slap down Athens, which it thinks is getting too uppity because Athens is challenging its own leadership in Attic Greece. And it's argued that there are all sorts of examples in history. The most recent, which people sometimes refer to, is the rise of Germany in Europe in the early part of the last century. All sorts of examples of the big kid on the block having some difficulty making way for sharing things with the second kid on the block. Now, I think that if you look back over the history of 60 years, when thanks primarily to American leadership, the world has become a more peaceful and prosperous place. I think it's inconceivable that the United States, as we move forward, won't understand that it has to develop a better and warmer and more effective and more honest relationship with China. I hope that China feels the same way. I hope that it feels the same way about trade, an issue which will affect all of you, will affect Hong Kong, and will affect me and others too. Because I read what the American Chamber of Commerce has to say in Beijing, and I read what the European Chamber of Commerce has to say in Beijing, and I ask myself, how does this match all the promises we got when I was negotiating with Pascal Lamy and others, China's accession to the WTO? The points that President Trump, whom I don't agree with on anything, on much, sorry. A point that he makes, on which I do agree, is his concerns about trade and about whether or not China is actually playing fair by the rules. You look at the experience of internet companies in China. You look at the purchase recently by a Chinese company of the biggest industrial robotics firm in the world, a German firm, Kuba, and you ask yourself, what would have happened if a European or American firm had been trying to do the same in China? And you know what the answer is. At the risk of getting Wenwei Po too excited, when we were negotiating the Chinese accession to the WTO, the Commerce Minister of China was Bo Xilai. And I can remember Bo Xilai saying to us, I think saying to the President of the Commission, Romano Prodi, and myself, saying, as an old Chinese saying, if you show me an inch of respect, I'll show you a mile. Well, if you read the American Chamber of Commerce report from Beijing, it sort of looks like the other way around. You go to Washington, the Consul General can't say things like this, but you go to Washington, you find that what President Trump says about trade with China is what most democratic leaders say about trade with China as well. And most people across the establishment say about trade with China. There was an interesting op-ed piece by Thomas Friedman not very long ago, hugely complimentary about what China has done in the field of the environment and environmental technology, but making this point about a level playing field. I think it would be a disaster if a disagreement on trade turned into outright protectionism affecting China and the United States. And you might remember that in the period, the 15 years of fastest economic growth in China, Chinese exports to the United States went up by 1,600%. People who go into Walmart, maybe understandably, were pleased by the low prices they had to pay for things. So you had in America deflationary growth. Then they got home and they looked at where the things were made and saw their job being exported to the countries that it mentioned on the label. And that's a real problem for the international community, and the way we've tackled it in the past is by having rules and international agreements and international organizations which make certain that everybody plays the game in the same way. And to an astonishing degree, America is probably the only great power in the history of the world which has been prepared to accept the rules that apply to everybody else as well. It's an extraordinary thing, particularly noticeable after the Second World War, but still noticeable today. So I think and hope that China and the United States can find a sensible and fair modus vivendi, a sensible and fair way of working together. And if we didn't think that was important enough, you have the situation in North Korea today. I pointed out, slightly to their alarm the other day, that London was closer to Pyongyang than Los Angeles is. So these are issues for all of us. Speaking as somebody who's been to Pyongyang and isn't intending to make an early return visit, I think these are issues which demand extremely deep sophistication and honesty on both sides, because if it's not resolved by America and China working together, it's not going to be resolved. And it's going to be really difficult. So, all that will affect Hong Kong as well. Overall, I think, which I've said many times, this remains a great city. It's one of the freest cities in the world, one of the freest cities in Asia. It's maybe bad luck, but it happens to be true that Hong Kong is absolutely at the crossroads of many of the issues which are going to shape the 21st century. And the people who shape what Hong Kong is like are in many cases today university students. So quite important that the community should talk to one another, as well as make sure that others continue to take an interest in how Hong Kong develops, giving credit to China as it does so, but above all, showing how terrific the citizens of Hong Kong are in standing up for the sort of things that all of us believe in. Thank you very much.